Diana Ross was the only woman Michael Jackson truly trusted, so much so he named her in his will to raise his children. But as Michael spiraled in his final days, Diana remained silent. Now she reveals the one moment she should have stepped in, and the haunting regret that still keeps her awake at night.
You have to understand, this wasn't just a friendship. It wasn't just a mentorship. What existed between Diana Ross and Michael Jackson was a spiritual contract, signed in the sweat and tears of Motown, before Michael even knew what the word contract meant. When the world looked at Michael Jackson, they saw the king of pop, a titan, a god among men. But when Diana Ross looked at him, she saw the 9-year-old boy who lived in her house, who sat on her floor watching her apply eyeliner, who soaked up her movements like a sponge because he wanted to be her. Not be with her, be her. And that distinction is why, when the 2002 will was unsealed, the entire Jackson family gasped. It wasn't his father, Joe. It wasn't his siblings. If his mother, Catherine, could not care for his children, Michael placed the lives of Prince, Paris, and Blanket into the hands of Diana Ross.
Think about the weight of that. In the legal document that defined his legacy, Michael bypassed his own blood to appoint Diana as the ultimate protector of his offspring. That is a level of trust that transcends romance. It is absolute. It is the trust of a child looking for a mother who will never hurt him. And that trust is exactly why the silence of 2009 is so deafening. Because if Diana was the appointed guardian of his children, she was, by proxy, the guardian of the child inside Michael. And in those final desperate months leading up to June 25th, that child was screaming for help. And the one person who had the power to stop the machine, the one person who could have walked into that rehearsal at the Staples Center and shut it down with a single look, was nowhere to be found.
To truly grasp the magnitude of this regret, we have to strip away the tabloids and look at the psychological architecture of their relationship. You see, in the late 60s, Michael didn't just meet Diana Ross, he was absorbed by her. For a brief, critical window in his development, he lived with her. She became the surrogate mother figure that shaped his entire conception of love, art, and safety. He called her Mama well into his adulthood. He famously said he wanted to marry her, and while the press laughed, Michael wasn't joking. In his mind, she was the archetype. She was the safety net. And for decades, she played that role perfectly. When he collapsed in 1995, she was the first one rushing to the hospital, pushing past handlers, demanding answers. She was the fierce lioness.
But then came the drift. The 2000s were a brutal era for Michael. The trials, the accusations, the exile to Bahrain. He built walls so high that even the people who loved him couldn't climb them. And Diana? She did what any respectful friend does when they see someone hurting. She gave him space. She didn't want to be another voice in his ear, another hand in his pocket. She saw the vultures circling him, the promoters, the doctors, the sycophants, and she made a conscious choice to not be part of the noise. She thought she was being respectful. She thought she was giving him dignity. But looking back, that distance is the knife in the heart. Because Michael didn't need dignity in 2009. He needed an intervention. He needed someone with the moral authority to look him in the eye and say no.
And this is where the tragedy pivots into horror. We know now that Michael was surrounded by yes-men. Dr. Conrad Murray needed the paycheck. AEG Live needed the dates. The entourage needed the proximity to fame. Every single person in Michael's orbit in 2009 was incentivized to keep him standing, keep him moving, keep him medicated. There was zero incentive for anyone to say stop. Except Diana. She didn't need his money. She didn't need his fame. She was Diana Ross. She was the only person on the planet who held leverage over him that had nothing to do with economics. If Diana Ross had flown to Los Angeles in May 2009, walked into that Carrollwood Drive mansion and saw the IV stands and the oxygen tanks, she wouldn't have cared about the tour cancellation fees. She would have seen the little boy she raised.
The regret that haunts the inner circle, and reportedly Diana herself, centers on a specific window of time, late May 2009. Rumors were swirling. Pictures were leaking of a frail Michael. Industry insiders were whispering that he couldn't do the 50 shows. Phone calls were made to various people, frantic calls from inside the camp saying, "He's not well." Diana was reachable, she was there, but the call was never made, or if it was, the urgency was downplayed. There is a haunting what-if scenario that plays out like a film reel. Imagine Diana Ross walking into the rehearsal. The music stops. The dancers freeze. Kenny Ortega steps down. She walks up to Michael, who is trembling, wearing 3 layers of clothes in the heat, and she takes his hand. Not the King of Pop's hand, the hand of the boy from Gary, Indiana, and she says, "We are going home."
She could have done it. She is perhaps the only human being alive who could have overruled Michael's own ambition and fear. Michael was terrified of financial ruin, yes, but he was more terrified of disappointing Diana. Her approval was the gold standard of his life. If she had framed the cancellation not as a failure, but as a necessity, he would have listened. The enablers would have been powerless against her. You cannot kick Diana Ross out of the room. You cannot intimidate the woman who survived the Supremes and Motown and Berry Gordy. She would have fired Dr. Murray on the spot. She would have called the lawyers. She would have acted as the guardian he appointed her to be, but for him, not just his children.
But she didn't know, or she didn't know enough. The information entropy here is staggering. The people who knew the truth about the propofol were keeping it locked in a vault of silence, and the people who loved Michael were kept on the outside, fed press releases and everything is fine narratives. Diana relied on the official channels. She trusted that if things were truly dire, Catherine would call, or Michael himself would reach out. But Michael was a shame. That's the key psychological twist. He didn't want his mama to see him like that. He hid his addiction from her more fiercely than he hid it from the public. He wanted to present the image of the invincible king to her until the very end. By respecting his privacy, she inadvertently allowed him to hide his self-destruction.
Let's look at the data of addiction intervention. The most successful interventions usually come from a peer plus authority figure, someone the addict views as superior in wisdom but equal in love. For Michael, his brothers were peers, but he felt competitive with them. His mother was authority, but he protected her from his darkness. Diana was the peer plus. She was the sweet spot of authority and unconditional love. There is a story, often whispered among Motown historians, about the time in the 80s when Michael started changing his face. Diana was one of the few who told him to stop. She grabbed his chin, looked at the surgery, and told him he was ruining what God gave him. He didn't listen then, but he didn't cut her off. He couldn't. He respected her too much. That dynamic proved she had the capital to spend in 2009.
And consider the aftermath. When the news broke, Diana didn't go on a press tour. She didn't write a tell-all book. She issued a statement that was barely 2 sentences long. I am unable to imagine this. That isn't just grief. That is shock. That is the sound of someone realizing that while they were looking away, the house burned down. The naming of her in the will as the backup guardian was the final twist of the knife. It was Michael's voice from the grave saying, I trust you with my most precious possession. It was a validation of her role, but it also highlighted the void of her absence in his final struggles. It placed a burden on her conscience that is almost Shakespearean in its tragedy. He trusted her to raise his kids, but he didn't trust her enough to save him from himself? Or did he trust her too much, assuming she would step in without being asked? We have to analyze the bystander effect in the world of high-level celebrity. Everyone assumes someone else is handling it. The makeup artist assumes the manager is handling the health. The manager assumes the doctor is handling it. The doctor assumes the family is involved. And the friend, the surrogate mother, assumes that if it were life and death, someone would have told her. In this circle of assumption, Michael slipped through the cracks. Diana's regret isn't about a lack of love, it's about a lack of action. It's the realization that love, in its passive form, wasn't enough to fight the active demon of acute propofol intoxication and corporate greed.
There is a moment in the documentary This Is It where Michael looks frail, lost, and confused on stage. To the fans, it was heartbreaking. To Diana, it must be excruciating. Because she knows the signs. She knows the body language of the Motown exhaustion. She knows the difference between Michael is tired and Michael is dying. Watching that footage now, she likely sees a dozen entry points where she could have interjected. A flight to London, a surprise visit to the rehearsal, a call to the CEO of AEG. Any of these actions could have derailed the train. But we must also consider the counterintuitive perspective. Would Michael have hated her for it? If she had stopped the tour, the financial collapse would have been immediate. The humiliation would have been public. He might have lashed out. He might have exiled her. And perhaps that fear held her back. The fear of overstepping, of being the one to pop the bubble. But ask yourself, and ask any mother, would you rather your child hate you and be alive, or love you and be dead? That is the calculus that keeps Diana awake. She played the long game of friendship, preserving the relationship, not realizing the short game of survival was being lost. The will remains the physical artifact of this bond. Every time she sees Prince, Paris, or Blanket, or BG as he goes by now, she sees the living testament of Michael's trust. But she also sees the orphans of her own inaction. It is a harsh judgment, perhaps unfair, but grief is rarely fair. The cinematic exposé of this story isn't about a scandalous secret or a hidden affair. It is about the quiet, creeping tragedy of a phone that didn't ring and a car that didn't drive to the Staples Center.
In the end, Diana Ross's final regret is a mirror for all of us who have watched a friend spiral. We wait for the right time to speak up. We wait for the invitation to intervene. We respect boundaries until the boundaries become chalk outlines. Michael Jackson died surrounded by people, yet completely alone. The one woman who could have pierced that bubble was waiting for a signal that never came. And that silence, the silence between the Queen of Motown and the King of Pop in those final critical months, is the loudest sound in music history. It is a silence that screams, "I should have stopped him." And the tragedy is, she could have.